In my last video, I went over the concept of masculinity throughout history as it was performed. Seeing masculinity performed by the human body is a lot different than seeing it portrayed through a story or fictional narrative. Think about your favorite book, alternatively, your favorite story. You have an idea of what those characters were like, how they looked, how they reacted to events. Now, does that story have a movie or TV adaptation? Did that adaptation live up to the idea of the character you already had? More than likely not. A perfect example of this would be Thanos from the Marvel Universe. Thanos in the comic and Thanos in the movie are two separate villains. Why? Because of their motives. See, the original Thanos from the comics wanted to impress Death, the female embodiment of decay and destruction. Yes, another female characterization that they caused some evil in the universe. Death originally appeared to Thanos when he was younger as a girl in his class. She got him to start murdering fellow Titans, which eventually led to him killing his mother to satisfy his thirst for murder. Thanos constantly tried to court Death, but she always rejected his advances. However, when Thanos decided to embrace his true nature, Death accepted him on one condition: he prove he only belonged to her. Thanos did this by ravaging every world he came across, but nothing ever satisfied her. Death is sort of like the balance between light and dark of the Force in Star Wars. However, the movie version of Thanos was much different. They did not attribute his actions to gaining the affection of a woman, but to bringing a balance in the universe. He transformed into this eco-terrorist on a mission from a utilitarian perspective. While it created a character arc for Thanos, it drastically changed his motive. See, stories help drive an overarching narrative for certain norms and behaviors within society. This is something that Jordan Peterson gets right. While I absolutely loathe anything else he spouts, this grand narrative for men is disappearing before our eyes. What do I mean by grand narrative? Well, just like I did in part 1 of this video series, let's look at the historical reference of men in narratives. Part 2. Masculinity as the narrative. I'm not going to start at anything before written language, since most of our theories about human beings are just narratives we've constructed from archaeological evidence. I feel like they're already stories, and I covered a lot of those in my first video. However, I'm going to break this into parts and not go through a historical timeline. I'm going to talk about masculinity as it pertains to deities, heroes, and the fictional. Deities. See, gods and deities have always been a way to express cultural ideas. Masculinity is one of the biggest examples I can think of. Greek and Roman gods are some of the first deities that come to mind. Zeus, or Jupiter, was the king of the gods and was often referred to as the father of gods and men. He shared the rule of the world with Hades and Poseidon, both of which were men and his brothers. He was incredibly promiscuous, even though he was married to his sister Hera, the goddess of marriage and monogamy. Hypocrisy. Zeus was described as the god who brought peace in place of violence and as the Lord of Justice. He was the supreme cultural embodiment of Greek religious beliefs. He had many titles that emphasized those aspects. He was the patron of hospitality. He was the keeper of oaths. He watched over trade and punished dishonest traders. He was the bearer of aegis, which struck terror into the impious and his enemies. Zeus's servants were even named Force and Violence. Ares was the god of war. He was the physical embodiment of physical aggression necessary for success in war, but because of that, he was dangerous in battle. He was characterized as a coward because he couldn't take criticism and always reacted in outrage. He is constantly humiliated whenever he's talked outside of battle. He also had many children. Most of them were mortals. Hercules is the son of Zeus and a mortal woman. He is the symbol of masculinity, known for his extraordinary strength, courage, and cleverness. Whenever his brawn couldn't do the job, he would use his wits. One of the great stories about Hercules is the 12 labors that was given him in order to purify his sins and grant him immortality. Hercules was driven to madness by Hera, in which he killed his children and threw his best friend over the city's walls to his death. Hercules is the only god that had multiple cults surrounding his image. The Romans adopted most of these gods and changed their names. More importantly, during this time, the male gods had attributes and behaviors of violence, wisdom, fire, agricultural, death, sea, and the sun. They had domained over the physical realm that included things of force and power. Goddesses, on the other hand, were in charge of things like animals and flowers, fortune, marriage, wisdom, and love and beauty. They contrasted the masculine with that of the feminine. The God of the Old Testament is also a form of masculinity. He is the creator, and while he is not depicted as the only God who exists, but the only one the people of Israel should follow. Being one of the first monotheistic religions, Judaism places God at its center. God is the moral lawgiver and is the source of all goodness. He uses violence when it suits his aims and commands obedience through fear. He not only is the bringer of justice, but also provides a means for salvation. While this deity does not have a human form, he is the embodiment of strength, justice, and wisdom in the Christian worldview. Jesus redefined masculinity by bringing a more docile view, to be more like Christ-like in the basis of Christianity. Christ is normally depicted as a frail and weak-looking Middle Eastern man. He lived in poverty and held no material possessions. Jesus showed an immense amount of emotion by weeping over Jerusalem and his friend's death. He was viewed as tender and nurturing through his actions of taking care of the poor, the ill, and those who mourned. Jesus did not have this machismo idea of masculinity. He rarely showed any anger except when it came to his convictions. His actions towards the traitors in the temple are an example of this anger for justice mentality. Jesus was a pacifist, this being exemplified in his willingness to be crucified. Protecting one's body was the epitome of manliness, and Jesus just threw it away. However, depending on which Gospels you read, Jesus is characterized differently. Mark presents Jesus as crying out on the cross to God as he hangs crucified, while John, on the other hand, states that Jesus remained without emotion or regret. Muhammad was very similar to Jesus. He was generally depicted as being of a sturdy build with long muscular limbs. He dressed in modest clothes consisting of a shirt, a sheet thrown over his shoulders, and a turban. Many texts describe him as a gentle and kind-hearted person who generally overlooked the shortcomings of others. He was polite, courteous, compassionate, and sincere. He was extremely humble. He always partook in household work, no matter what it was. He would have fun with the children, and they loved on them, and he loved on them. One of the biggest examples of masculinity was the complete and utter trust in Allah. He held the concept of just and kindness in high regards. He taught love for the poor and fellow human beings. On the other hand, he also took part in military excursions. More than a great field and general tactician, he was also a military theorist, organizational reformer, strategic thinker, operational level combat commander, political military leader, heroic soldier, and a revolutionary. The inventor of insurgency warfare and history's first successful practitioner, Muhammad had not only had no military training before he commanded an army in the field. For the most part, much of the deities we have constructed embody some larger aspect of masculinity, from being a courageous and strong warrior to being a loving and caring father figure. Their behavior mostly surrounds the use of force and violence against their enemies and people outside their tribe. While some of these figures have some positive elements of masculinity that we could use today, they are outdated and rely on a patriarchal structure where men are viewed as these protectors / bringers of justice. They balance the powers of good and evil by themselves. Heroes. More broadly, this is any person in history that has a sensationalized story behind them. They hold a certain prestige in the culture and society that they were a part of. One of the biggest I can think of in our society is the framers of the Constitution. There are many in our society that hold these individuals as godlike. They see them as the most brilliant people that have ever lived. They hold their work as sacred texts that were perfect in every regard. They embody this idea of masculinity, of pioneering and innovating new things. Of course, they were all white, and the majority of them actually owned slaves. But this actually builds into the narrative of masculinity. They had the wealth to own other human beings. They had gained power through their own hard work and intellect. They were self made men creating the roadmap for society. Like Moses being handed the commandments, these figures handed the future a document of the same caliber. Albert Einstein was notably known for his advancement of science and his hand in the creation of the atomic bomb. We celebrate his intellect because of its use to help us win the war. He's not really known for being a humanitarian and peace activist. Martin Luther King Jr. is known for his nonviolent protests to help advance civil liberties in America. He isn't known much for his views on democratic socialism, his opposition to the Vietnam War, or his doctoral work in theology. His passiveness is celebrated. Contrast that to Malcolm X, who took a more hardline and violent approach. He's barely mentioned in a positive light. We hold Martin Luther King Jr. to a higher degree than Malcolm X in our classrooms. I would say that even though both of them are black men, society has decided that we want a more passive approach to challenging authority. And it doesn't hurt that, it doesn't help Malcolm X that he was a Muslim. Muhammad Ali may be one of the best boxers to have ever lived. He embodies masculinity through sport, hard work and determination, tact and skill in fighting, and the use of violence. However, he got a lot of backlash for his vehement opposition to the Vietnam War. More generally, our sports figures tell us stories of how hard work and training can bring anyone to greatness. The only thing stopping you from becoming the best baseball player is practice, of course. Our military heroes paint the picture of unwavering sacrifice for our tribe and its members, and the celebration of the art of violence. Take a look at the most decorated soldier in history, Audie Murphy. The Germans scored a direct hit on an M10 tank destroyer, setting it alight, forcing the crew to abandon it. Murphy ordered his men to retreat to the positions in the woods, remaining alone at this point, shooting his M1 carbine and directing artillery fire via his field radio while the Germans aimed fire directly at his position. Murphy mounted the abandoned burning tank destroyer and began firing its .50 caliber machine gun at the advancing Germans, killing a squad crawling through a ditch towards him. For an hour, Murphy stood on the flaming tank destroyer, returning German fire from foot soldiers and advancing tanks, killing or wounding 50 Germans. He sustained a leg wound during his stand and stopped only after he ran out of ammunition. Murphy rejoined his men, disregarded his own injury, and led them back to the repeal of the Germans. He insisted on remaining with his men while his wounds retreated. His disregard for his own life and how he stood courageously in front of the enemy paints the picture of the protector trope of masculinity. Pat Tillman is another military figure that is held in high regard. He's better known for turning down a $3.6 million contract to join the military. He's celebrated because he gave up everything in order to serve his country. The right painted him as this poster child of their values until it was revealed that he viewed the invasion of Iraq as illegal. He wasn't religious at all, had liberal views, and was going to meet with Noam Chomsky after he returned from deployment. Those things are never mentioned when people talk about Pat Tillman. Another interesting soldier is Desmond Doss, whom the movie Hacksaw Ridge was written about. I was a combat medic in the Army and I never heard of this individual, even though many medics were idolized in my training. Desmond Doss was a conscientious objector that served in World War II and refused to kill nor carry a weapon in battle. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for exceptional valor in aiding wounded soldiers under fire. During the Battle of Okinawa, he saved the lives of 50 to 100 wounded infantrymen on top the area known by the 96th Division as the Medea Escarpment or Hacksaw Ridge. Des was wounded 4 times in Okinawa and was evacuated on May 24, 1945, aboard the USS Mercy. Doss suffered a left arm fracture from a sniper's bullet and at one point had 17 pieces of shrapnel embedded in his body. If you've seen the movie, Read about the real actions of Desmond Doss because they are even crazier than what is depicted in the movie. In all our stories about war heroes, what we exclude is just as important as what we include. We create a version of masculinity that we want by the exclusion of Pat's personal beliefs or Doss being a conscientious objector. Their sacrifice is idolized over their personal convictions, unless those convictions align with this notion of supranationalism or the military industrial complex. This further cements the idea of masculinity being the sacrificial male protector, that men have no real value unless they're willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of society. Fictional. Fictional characters are another way we build these super tropes of masculinity. From superheroes to westerns, these genres produce a certain expectation of what masculinity is. What are some of the most iconic fictional men in history you can think of? Let's take a look at some of the most popular that I can think of. When we think of westerns, what is the most iconic name of them all? John Wayne, best known for his rugged and tough appeal, which eventually became the embodiment of American ideas. Not only were the roles he chose to play a projection of masculinity, the rough and tough cowboy, but also his personal views. Wayne was vocally prominent conservative Republican with a hard stance against communism. He promoted conservative causes and produced war propaganda for the Vietnam War. His persona on and off the camera painted the same picture of masculinity, the self-made, strong, white, heterosexual male. So much he once confronted actor Kirk Douglas over his decision to play Vincent van Gogh in the film Lust for Life by saying, "Christ, Kirk, how can you play a part like that? There's so goddamn few of us left. We got to play strong, tough characters, not those weak queers." Another cultural icon of the West is Clint Eastwood. Similar to John Wayne, Clint built his brand around the rugged individual cowboy that kills bad people by the dozen. Later, he plays the role of a hard-edged police inspector, still a bringer of justice, Harry, in the film Dirty Harry. Many attribute the invention of the loose cannon cop with this movie. Harry's masculinity was tied to his .44 Magnum revolver, kind of like Rick Grimes from The Walking Dead, and birthed his most famous line.
I know what you're thinking, punk. You're thinking, did he fire 6 shots or only 5? Now, to tell you the truth, I forgot myself in all this excitement. But being this is a .44 Magnum, the most powerful handgun in the world, and will blow your head clean off, you've got to ask yourself the question, do I feel lucky?
Clint's political interests were somewhat a part of his masculine appeal. As a registered libertarian, he gave a speech directed to an empty chair representing President Obama at the 2012 Republican National Convention. Another cultural icon is everyone's favorite boxer, Rocky Balboa. He encapsulates almost every aspect of American masculinity. From his extreme patriotism to his terrible beginning in life, Rocky rose through it all to become successful. Lines such as, "Yeah, my old man, who was never the sharpest, told me I weren't born with much brain, so I better use my body," paint Rocky as this just average working person who uses his body to produce capital. The first 2 movies show sheer determination and work ethic can produce positive results, that when life knocks you down, you get back up. In Rocky 3, he fights Clubber Lang, who is this embodiment of rage, aggression, and power. In the first few minutes of their first fight, Rocky hammers Lang, but Lang shows no sign of being hurt. He takes it all like nothing and releases a barrage of punches that destroys not only Rocky's body, but also his confidence. This movie then becomes a story about Darwin's survival of the fittest, where victory is achieved through adapting and becoming a more skilled fighter than the one with raw power and aggression. In Rocky 4, the fight becomes a 2-part narrative about masculinity. The first part is the American way of life. Raki is literally fighting communism. It's a war of ideas played out through the masculine body. The second narrative is one of how hard work and sheer determination will beat technology and science every time. This appeal to nature being the dominant form of training and cultivation of masculinity, that real men are somehow made in a journey through natural elements. As we take a step away from movies, another media we tend to look over that defines masculinity is advertising. Advertising has become a huge part of our narrative. Look at the popularity of the Super Bowl ads. Some people only tune in to watch them. From characters like the Marlboro Man or Dos Equis, most interesting man in the world, male fashion models like David Gundy, Oliver Cheshire, Tyson Beckford, and Fabio, and even Uncle Sam. All these figures paint and produce the image of masculinity and then try to sell it to you through products. These figures then become staples of our culture and are projected as the ideal version of masculinity. The whole point of me taking the time to produce this video is to show how narratives that surround us shape and cultivate our current perceptions of masculinity. Stories have immense power to drive human behavior and action. We tell our kids stories that produce the behavior we expect of them. They learn by comparing themselves to these fictional characters, and then they ask themselves, what would he or she do in this situation? The media, music, and narratives we all produce collide together to paint this broader aspect of expectations of individuals in our society. My challenge is that all of our future writers, directors, actors, musicians, artists, and other creative fields produce clear images of what masculinity should be in the 21st century, regardless if you feel so or not, but we all shape this idea of masculinity together. The same could be said for femininity as well. However, men are the ones that are currently enacting the biggest acts of violence in society today. This is my call to action to everyone. We need to create and develop a blueprint for men who are lost to find a place in society today that produces a sense of self-worth and value to the broader society. Thanks guys for listening. If you like my video, share, subscribe, leave a comment. Let's talk about this. And congratulations on wanting to become better men or wanting to be a part of this bigger narrative. Thank you.